Hello and welcome to the Audit Room. This is part 3 and the final part of the series on developing the audit universe. In part 1 and 2 we discussed how to identify auditable units within an organization and carry out risk assessments using the specific risk approach. In this part we will be discussing how to carry out audit risk assessments using the risk factor approach. If you haven't watched part 1 and 2, we suggest that you watch that first before proceeding with this video. Links are given in the description. The risk factor approach to risk assessment involves analyzing and assessing risks based on factors that are present across the organization. It is a top-down approach and looks at high-level conditions that are common across most auditable units and provides a macro-level view. It is important to note that risk factors are not the risks themselves. Instead, these are the factors that are associated with the presence of the risk. The first step in the process is to identify the potential risks that are relevant to the organization. The risks will largely depend on the organization size, industry, and a number of other factors. Some of the common risks that are present in many organizations may include strategic, financial, operational, legal, environmental, reputational, and other risks. These have been covered in part 2 of this series. The next step is to identify the factors or conditions that are associated with the presence of the risks identified in step 1. Remember, the factors may vary from one organization to another depending on the size and industry. Here are some common risk factors that may be used. Map each risk factor against the relevant risk category as shown here. Once the risk factors have been identified, the next step is to define the assessment criteria for each risk factor. The assessment criteria can be a threshold, a number, size, time, or event. To begin this exercise, plot the risk criteria and the corresponding factors on a spreadsheet as shown here. Next, determine the scoring scale for the assessment. The scale will depend largely on the organization's size. In this example, we will use a scale from 1 to 3, where 1 is the lowest and 3 is the highest score. Plot the scores against each factor as shown here. Then, for each score, define the assessment criteria as shown in this example. Remember that the criteria will vary from one organization to another and will largely depend on the organization's size and industry. The next step in the process is to assign a weightage to each factor. Weightage is essentially the importance of the risk factor in determining the overall risk score. Remember to ensure the total of all weightage to be 100%. Once you have determined the risk factors and the assessment criteria, the next step is to carry out the risk assessment. Here is a practical example of how to carry out the risk assessment. Start by listing down the auditable units in the first column as shown here. Refer to part 1 of this series on how to identify auditable units. Next, write down the risk factors that you had identified in the previous step in each column as shown here and state the weightage of each factor underneath it. Then for each risk factor, create 2 columns. The first column for score and the second column for the weighted score. Insert a formula to auto-calculate the weighted score, which is score multiplied by the weightage. Once you have set up the structure, start scoring each auditable unit by entering the score corresponding to the assessment criteria that you had defined in step 3 earlier. Once completed, add up the weighted scores to arrive at the total score for each auditable unit. The next step is to define the risk ranking matrix. This matrix will be used to identify the level of risk for each risk score. Here is an example of how to set the thresholds to determine the risk ranking. Remember that setting the threshold is judgmental and will vary from one organization to another. Once the risk ranking is in place, use it to determine the risk ranking of each auditable unit. The risk ranking will be used at a later stage when developing the risk-based internal audit plan. This is the end of our series on how to develop the audit universe and carry out risk assessment. Stay tuned for the next video where we will discuss how to develop an internal audit plan using the audit universe and risk assessment we have developed in this series. If you found this video useful, please do hit the like button. And if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments section. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more informative videos like this.